Thank you everyone for coming. As Issa mentioned, my name is Simon. This is Patty. We're going to do a kind of informal walkthrough of the works in the show. Please interrupt us if you have questions. There'll also be time to talk about it afterwards. But thank you again for coming on a rainy day. So the first work we'd probably want to think about is Fountain number 001. And when Silverlens and Patty approached me to think about Patty's new body of work, I was really taken by the kind of origin stories that Patty had spoken about the materials that were used to make the works themselves. And so maybe one idea to introduce about how I think a lot about Patty's work is something like a material science fiction. So maybe taking materials that were used for one purpose and then using them for a different purpose that maybe you could see how they might have been used in the future or they might have been used a long time ago. So that's a concept I think that maybe goes across many of the works. But Fountain in particular is interesting because it's embedded in a history of Filipino pre-colonial jewelry. So when you get a chance to read the text or look at the little blurb up on the front, I was really taken by the story of a construction worker named Edibilto Morales. So in 1981, he was a construction worker on the island of Mindanao in the Philippines, and he stumbled upon what is now known as the Surigao treasure, which is over 1,000 works of pre-colonial Filipino jewelry. And his story itself is really crazy. He finds this amazing source of gold and he's not sure what to do with it. People flock to the site and these thousands of pieces of gold become scattered. Over the course of the next 40 years, they're very meticulously regathered, and just maybe 5 or 10 years ago, they were put up in a really large exhibition in the Philippines that Patty saw. And one of the works in particular is what's called a Hindu upavita, and it might have been used by the indigenous peoples of the Mindanao Islands as early as the 11th century, so like 1000 AD. 500 years even before Magellan would arrive and the Spanish colonization would begin. So essentially what you're looking at here is that same or similar pattern of weaving used in that Hindu upavita, but Patty used a material of abaka, which is native to Mindanao as well as another couple other islands in the Philippines, and is a very key item in Spanish trade, but also up to today in textiles. It produces Manila, that you might know from the Manila envelope, but it is an example for me of how Patty took an item, a fruit of the soil, one might say, of abaka, and then recast it in the version of a pre-colonial jewelry that might have said something about what the Philippines' creativity was like before Spanish colonization and what it might be in the future. But Patty, maybe you want to talk a little bit more about it before I gab too much.
Well, yeah, I guess stepping back a little bit, in my practice, I guess one of the main things that I'm really interested in is, along what Simon says, are like all these fictions and non-fictions. I mean, we live in a jumble of all these kinds of ideas, and we have been living in a kind of age of information where we can mine so much, so much data, fake news, and all of these things. And my interest in my art practice really is how our material culture embodies this sort of sets of references and a kind of constellation of ideas, and how when we perceive these materials, they just, I guess, trigger a lot of ideas, a lot of stories, a lot of histories. And it's really about this kind of relationship with material culture. We just love things, right? We love things, we live with so many things, and I guess my idea is to kind of highlight certain materials and draw certain connections, our own connections with them. And obviously, with these works, it's this connection to our pre-colonial history and our colonial history. I always think of like kind of different materials to work with throughout the years, and abaka is one of those materials that I've kind of stocked in my studio, kind of looked at over the years and not really figured out how I was going to use it. And then I saw this exhibit of gold jewelry. And I thought that because this, even if it's 1,000 pieces, it is such a tiny collection in a way, right? And it is also perhaps the only real collection that we have of pre-colonial jewelry in the Philippines. So the only other knowledge that we have of pre-colonial jewelry exists in a manual, in a book called the Boxer Codex, where European illustrator drew the costumes of the Philippines. And that's kind of how we knew about these sort of big gold sashes. So pre-colonial Filipino people only dressed in gold, basically. They were covered in gold from their heads to their ankles. They had these huge bracelets and everything. And before the Surigao treasure was found in 1981, which is so recent, right? We only knew them from this Boxer Codex. So not a lot of people know about it. And a couple of years ago, there was an article that came out in the Smithsonian about a shipwreck. And we do know that, well, I don't know if many of you know, but part of Philippine history is that we were discovered by Spain in 1521, and they decided that we would become the main port for trade between East and West. And so the Spanish galleon, also called the Acapulco galleon or the Manila galleon, depending on where you're looking at it from, plied the Pacific Ocean for 200 plus years. And most of these ships were built actually in the Philippines. So out of the 300 ships that sailed, 289, something like this, were built in the Philippines. So there was a shipwreck, and they had recovered a chest of gold, and it had all these exquisite gold jewelry as well, filigree, and one of them was also a big sash of medallions. And so I thought, this sash looks exactly like the illustration from the Boxer Codex, which was from 1580s. But the jewelry historian quoted in this Smithsonian article said that where the jewelry did come from Manila, they were made by Chinese artisans. And so I was like, even up to this day, people still don't believe that we can make good jewelry, you know? So this was my thought. And so I wrote to her, and we exchanged research, ideas, and all of these things. And that's when it came to me that maybe I can make a work that would kind of draw the connections, you know, with different materials and how jewelry was made. And also just the whole trade, the entire history of trade. And so these abaka ropes, the Philippines had been making it for also hundreds and hundreds of years because it is a native plant in the Philippines. And we make it into clothing, we make it into these shipping cordages. And so these cords were part of the Manila galleon as well as rigging ropes. And so I said, okay, then maybe I can make something. And yeah, so this is how it came to be, I guess.
And I feel that, you know, they're very much saturated in this history, this kind of Patty's intervention across colonial and pre-colonial history, but they also have their own presence in the gallery, of course, right? You know, they seem to be lifting off the ground by themselves. They have kind of their own sort of volition. They kind of snake around and hug different pieces
Right,
of
right,
the architecture. And I wonder, maybe, Patty, we can turn to one of the tapestries and how they continue this theme. And I can just read the title of this piece. This one is called An Unraveling, Conversation Among Ruins After Amorsolo. So Amorsolo as in Fernando Amorsolo, a kind of Filipino master who Patty is kind of taking up those paintings and reimagining them through her own tapestry processes. So maybe do you want to speak about that?
Yeah. So as I was saying, my interest is really how material culture forms this kind of constellation, and how, I guess, materials and things kind of influence our consciousness, and I guess highlighting certain processes and modes of production and material as well, I guess kind of change how we view these things. And so usually I take art historical images and I appropriate them in my paintings and in the tapestries. And for this series of tapestries that I've been working on for almost 10 years, what I did, specifically with this Amorsolo, is that I got a painting of Fernando Amorsolo. Fernando Amorsolo lived during the American period, which is about from 1902 to just after the World War II. And he was one of the most popular Filipino painters. Now, I guess what we have to understand is that Western fine art didn't really come to the Philippines until the late 1800s, because even if we were under Spanish rule for more than 300 years since the 1500s, they never bothered to set up schools to educate us. And they really only opened up access to public education in the mid-1800s. And that's when a lot of the Filipino elite traveled to Spain and started learning Western fine art. And so our history of our own art, I guess, just went on or was erased by history and all of that, and then a reintroduction of Western fine art in the 19th century. And I find these paintings from the late 1800s and the American period very interesting, because I guess from a contemporary point of view, we're painting in a Western style, and how, I guess I just wanted to ask how authentic that was. But in a way, it was authentic because it was in that context as well. And so let's say a painter went to Spain to learn how to paint, and their first study was the death of Cleopatra, for example, which has nothing to do with our history. But this is how the academe, the fine art academe was taught. And the paintings to me kind of embodied, I guess, like historical records that we've been reading, that we've been learning in school, that come from a very particular point of view. And I mean, I guess to put it bluntly, it's written by our colonizers from the point of view of them, by male historians, and I wanted to translate that, and I wanted to transform the kind of language that it represented. So what I did was I replaced all the information in the original painting with technology, with digital images, and I collaged these digital images to reconstruct the painting again, the painting image. And then the entire study was put in a loom, in a digital loom, and woven into this tapestry. And I felt that by replacing it with digital digital imagery with a digital process, and then with threads, I was, translating and translating and translating it into this kind of more contemporary language that feels a bit more inclusive. Also because I work with I work with a family of weavers. So instead of a painting that is a product of the lone master in his own studio, how we see painters as a hero in their own studio, this is a product of a community, of a group of weavers, and of technology as well. Yeah, and I guess it's also related to how I did this.
Yes, and I'd always found these interesting because I hadn't really seen many Fernando Amorsolo paintings before, but if you look them up, they're usually kind of images of pastoral, kind of like
that's right.
rural life, and he is a very interesting figure, right?
Yeah.
He is from the Philippines, but trained in the West. There's a lot to relate to
Yes.
and I think it's troubled, right, by this transition or translation into a kind of digital tapestry.
Yeah.
And they become quite abstract, right? When you look at them, you're not quite sure what you're looking at. In the process of translation, there are glitches, there are kind of different errors that I think evoke some of the smaller pieces within the rope works as well, where you have the bits of clay or the bits of gold. If we turn to the larger work, which I'll read the title of, White Lies Balanced on a Ball, there begins to be other materials that you incorporate into the tapestry, right? So this one is wool primarily. And however, this one starts to incorporate some more materials. So maybe do you want to speak about the materials and why you chose some of them?
Right. Yeah, a bunch of materials here. And I guess if you see the gray and the white areas here, these are called inabel, and they are hand-woven cotton canvas from the Philippines, very close to where I live now. And these were, we have used these as costumes and things for domestic use, but also widely used for the Manila galleons. So these were the sails for the Manila galleons. And they would just patch them together to create this huge sail. So I guess since I was creating such a huge piece, it just felt that it would be good to sort of like put a mix of materials. And
I can read the materials that it says even. So there's cotton and wool, there's hand-woven abaka or Manila hemp, there's the Ilocos cotton, the Iñabel that you mentioned, there's dried grass, there's canvas and other upcycled fabrics from discarded clothing, right? So maybe some of you know that Patty makes clothes, made more clothes in the past, but do you want to talk about that use of the materials or discarded fabrics?
Yeah. So, I have, I really try to use a lot of my discarded materials in my work as well. So with the weaving of the tapestries, we have to make a lot of tests of how I want it to look like. And so we have a lot of test weaves as well. And I find it such a waste to just, discard them. So I integrated them here as well. And I really want to point out the tinalak that you had mentioned, which is the hand-woven abaka, which are these black and beige weaves, the ikat design. And these are the exact same material as these ropes. Yeah. So you can see the raw fiber hanging from this rope, and that's exactly what was used here. And these are from Mindanao, very close to Surigao, from Lanao Lake. And the weavers who make these are called dream weavers because they get into a trance making these ikats. And then we have the dried grass here. We call them banigs, and they are the traditional sleeping beds, I guess, mattresses or covers used by Filipinos. And I guess I just wanted a mix kind of thing to just, ground it in a kind of history, as well as in a kind of story of narrative of domesticity, as well as apparel, as well as clothes and costumes, because of course the woman on the bowl.
Does she also come from an Amorsolo painting?
No, this one comes from a photograph, actually,
yes.
during the American period. That's when cameras came out as well in the early 1900s, and a lot of the documentation came out. She was photographed in a circus, and she's in a costume as well. She's in a kind of 1920s bathing suit. And American flags are waving behind her. And I thought it was just such an interesting photograph, because during the American period there was a program by the Americans called benevolent assimilation. And so they said that to turn us from savage to civilized, then we had to change our costumes as well. And I guess this to me was just a double thing, like costume and then another costume. And it felt, I mean, from my point of view, it felt that so aspirational. Yeah.
Well, it feels not only something like a redemption or reclamation of some of these histories, but also you're kind of troubling them or suggesting other ways of reading them, right?
Yeah.
Like the figure, I would have no idea that was the photograph.
Right.
And maybe we can turn to this last series before we can look at photographs altogether.
Yeah.
But these Frayed Garden works, which there are two of here, and there's also one on that smaller wall, I think are really interesting to end on, because they feel like versions of these tapestries, but the abstraction has taken over any kind of image, and you're left with just the raw materials that are themselves. So the materials that were at one point, tasked with representing or showing images are now just themselves in these kind of like, either visions of the future or the past. And I can read some of these more materials too, just so people know. I find it quite interesting. There's acrylic, printed velvet, silk, wool, abaka, Manila hemp, and cotton. Do you want to speak a little bit about how you came to decide to make these works?
Right. Yeah. So usually I work with images, as I mentioned. I always work with sort of art historical images, and at some point, I decided that I wanted to kind of break free. So these are these are my first abstract works, actually. And I feel like I just vomited everything onto the canvas. Yeah, I guess I wanted a kind of jumble again of to kind of show the plurality of concepts and stories, and I guess just this whole thread of relations.
They also seem to unravel, or they come off, or you could imagine a version of that, but just unraveled or out of resolution.
Yes, that's right, yeah. And you see all the kind of painting strokes, and usually these strokes I photograph, and these are the materials that I then collage and use for these tapestries. And so I don't usually show the actual painting, but here we see the raw kind of like brush strokes, and then I decided to print it on velvet as well, because it felt like, a confused view, and it's just playing around. And I guess it's a confluence of everything, but it also gave me a lot of freedom just to play around with the ground. And
you're not tied to the image.
Yes, exactly. So these are, the ground is the same Inabel, the one I was talking about, which is hand-woven cotton from Ilocos. Yeah, and then I have a little loom. So I wove some of these thicker parts here.
Like these here?
Yes, these silk and wool parts over here, and made the tassels.
Amazing. Well, maybe we can pause there and take questions.
Yeah. Well, no, not exactly, yes, because this one now came at the very end. The first step is the painting, which is all these sort of like squiggly lines here. And usually I stop there and take photographs of them and then use them as my material to collage and kind of change the information of the original paintings that I work with. Yeah, but these ones I decided to go further and just throw the whole house into the work. Yeah. You know, a lot of things, let's say, changed during the pandemic for me. I moved to the mountains, and I also wanted to kind of liberate myself from my own control. And this is when I started experimenting with these works. Yeah. And I guess they kind of tie in together. Yeah. I started corresponding with them, I think, way back in 2014, because I really wanted to make tapestries, and tapestries with images in particular, and I wanted to get a lot of detail in. And of course, in Europe, there is this great tradition of tapestry weaving. And I like the idea of how painting only came after tapestry in a way. Oil painting only came after tapestry. So before oil painting became super popular, it was really tapestry that adorned walls of people, and I guess that's kind of part of the way I think about materials, is like, how do our tastes change? What is, what drives certain materials to become popular or to be discarded, and all of these things. And so I actually corresponded with a lot of tapestry weavers from France, from the Netherlands, Belgium, and also the US, and kind of tested how they worked. And this family from Belgium ended up being the family that I wanted to work with. And so I visited them, and we chose all the threads, tagged all of them. And I guess one of the questions people have asked me over the years is why Belgium? Because they're great. They're very good. And because I can. And it felt like a reversal of power as well, where I can commission now this group of Belgian weavers to produce something for me.
Are they originally from the Philippines?
No. They are Belgian, yes. And they have been weaving also for generations and generations. So they really work with artists, and they restore old tapestries as well. Yeah. So it's mother, father, two sons, wife and husband. daughter and husband. Yeah, 3 kids.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's really a whole thing. So the abaka itself is really stiff, and if you try to bend it in like a sharp sort of curve, then you really need to put a lot of force in it. But what I found so interesting was that, because these are, I mean, we can see the structure in them, right? And the more structure it gains, the more length it gains, then the more fluid it becomes. So if it's short, it's tough, but if it's a length, then it's very pliant. And that's how they, and it's so interesting because it is now a soft structure in that sense, and very much kind of ties in with, I guess, how I want to present work. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I wore gloves because I did have some nails tear whenever I did not use gloves. So for the particular weave, as Simon mentioned, I was really inspired by Philippine jewelry and how a lot of Philippine jewelry are made are by sections of chains. And so if it is four-sided necklace or bracelet, for example, then it is 4 chains connected. But it's not made in an actual chain. It's made by 4 loops, and then another 4 loop, and then they catch each other. Yeah, until they become a length. And that's how I finally figured out how to weave these as well. So I would make 4 loops, 4 loops, 4 loops, 4 loops. And so I tried to kind of mimic how they would make it with wire, but I did it with rope. You really need to go through a lot of material. They are all over the place. Obviously, so much of our history has been erased and is just, somewhere else. But the Spanish, gosh, maybe Carlos would know the name. It's the indigenous something, Indio Biblioteca something, and it's in Spain, and they finally opened it and digitized everything, and you can access everything. So as long as you know the correct tag, then you can find original manuscripts, first-hand accounts, maps, beautiful diagrams and illustrations. It is a library of all the history from Mexico and South America, all the colonies. So it is the Library of Colonies, something like this. Yeah, yeah, and it is a gold mine. Yeah. Otherwise, of course, the university libraries have a lot, and there have been reprints of a lot of materials, which is great. Yeah, sure.
Amazing.